Hello everyone, and warm welcome to this first webinar of the webinar series Energy Futures. And today's session with the title, Can Hydrogen Deliver a Just Energy Transition? My name is Hannah Braun. I'm a campaigner with Attac Austria, and I'm really happy to host today's session with...
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm also very happy to be hosting this session together with Hannah today. I'm also an activist with Attac Austria, part of the Energy Democracy group, and I'm also currently studying political science in a master's program and have been doing some research also on Austrian hydrogen politics.
Thank you, Emma. So we're here today in the framework, in a broader framework of an Erasmus project called Empowering Energy Democracy, a holistic educational program that is aimed at raising awareness and to further educate the public, but also NGOs and activists about the energy transition, which is also why we chose the topic of hydrogen as the focus for today's session.
Yes, and I have the honor to very briefly introduce you to today's topic on hydrogen as a very contested energy future also, and try to give you a little bit an idea of the context of a hydrogen hype in the European Union. So as you might know, in the last few years, hydrogen was being hailed as a cornerstone of a green energy transition, and especially within the EU context and along its climate goals and green transition plans, such as the European Green Deal, hydrogen has been pushed since 2020. And the hydrogen strategy of the European Union was published in this year. It was embedded in post-COVID recovery plans such as Next Generation EU, and it was seen as a major element to decarbonize the European economy and also European industries. In 2022, the hydrogen targets have been massively extended and exacerbated as a consequence of the Russian aggression war on Ukraine and the need for the EU to become more independent of Russian gas and fossil energy sources. So key words that popped up in order to legitimize this expansion of domestic hydrogen on the one hand and massive imports on the other hand were keywords like energy security, diversification, and strategic autonomy. But it was not just the political circumstances and dynamics that led to this hydrogen hype on the European level. Several studies from Corporate Europe Observatory, for example, demonstrate that hydrogen has been pushed enormously by the fossil and gas lobby, which had masked itself as hydrogen lobby on a European level. And their lobby activities are massive. Alone in 2023, they had invested more than 75 million euros in lobbying activities, which is a lot compared to lobbying activities for big tech, for example. And it is obvious that these fossil companies push hydrogen with the goal to prolong their business models and to repurpose their assets, such as pipelines. So their interests are threatened by climate goals. So their strategy consists in establishing hydrogen as a green gas replacing fossil energies. Again and again, this hydrogen lobby also advocated for blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is produced using the same reforming process that is used to create gray hydrogen, but the CO2 released in this process should be captured in storage with so-called CCS technologies. Whereas green hydrogen is produced from renewable energies without any CO2 emissions, released within the process. So although the European hydrogen targets focus mainly on green hydrogen, the hydrogen lobby's activities have been so successful that certain loopholes and subsidies for this blue hydrogen, which is damaging the climate very much, that certain loopholes and subsidies for this form of or type of hydrogen has been created in the European regulation. However, this hydrogen hype has also been criticized by a lot of social movements and critical voices. Also, in July last year, the European Court of Auditors, Europäischer Rechnungshof for all the German-speaking guests today, published a report calling the European hydrogen targets unrealistic, and they criticized also the lack of solid analysis for the import and production of hydrogen. Also, critical voices from social movements and organizations are becoming louder, and the European perpetuate neo-colonial power relations, as most of the hydrogen that will be imported should be produced in regions and countries in the so-called global south. So as you might know, the production of green hydrogen is very energy and water intense and still very costly. So a lot of critical voices warn that the externalization of the hydrogen production, which is happening through the European hydrogen targets, could lead to massive social conflicts, energy poverty, land grabbing, because a lot of land is needed to install the renewable energies that is needed to produce green hydrogen, and also water scarcity. And mostly indigenous and local communities will be affected, and this is already happening. There are already taking place struggles in Morocco and South Africa, for example, on land issues and energy. So from an ecologically and socially just perspective, we must ask today in this webinar, what are the costs, the social and ecological costs of this rollout of a massive hydrogen production, not only here in Austria, but more importantly, also in those countries where the hydrogen should be imported from. And there are also several warnings against fossil lock-in effects through the repurpose of fossil infrastructure. So secondly, we must also ask who profits from this hydrogen economy, and how could a socially and ecologically just hydrogen future look like? And last but not least, it's unclear at the moment also how far or to which extent this hydrogen future is really going to be realized. Because yes, we have huge infrastructure projects such as the hydrogen backbone that is in the making at the moment. However, this huge rollout of a hydrogen economy stagnates. So in this webinar, we would like to find at least some answers to those huge questions with you all, and together also with our wonderful guests, Jakob Rammer and Elena Gerebica. A warm welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. Before Elena will start with her introduction and her input, I would like to introduce Jakob and Elena very briefly. Jakob is a student of international development at the University of Vienna, member of the editorial board of the Paulo Freire Center, and external consultant for Südwind. He conducts research on the extraction and trade of raw materials and green hydrogen in Latin America, with a special focus on Chile and its resulting conflicts and socio-ecological effects. Jakob will talk today about the Austrian hydrogen politics and policies and alternative hydrogen futures. Welcome, Jakob. And then we have also Elena Gerebica here today. She's joining us from Italy. And Elena works as a researcher and campaigner for the Italian nonprofit organization Recomon. Elena's focus will be on corporate interests in hydrogen and the building of large-scale infrastructure for the transport of hydrogen. Thank you very much, Elena, for being here today. And we hand over to your input.
Thank you, Emma. So I'm trying to share my presentation.
Meanwhile, I will jump in with a short organizational note. There will be time directly after the inputs to ask questions, either in person or via the chat, which we will monitor. If you have broader discussion questions that will take up more time, I will urge you to use a Slido link I will provide in the chat, where you can ask discussion questions and also vote on discussion questions that have already posted that we will discuss in the final segment of today's session after the inputs and the direct questions to the presentations from Elena and Jakob.
All right. Can you hear me well? Yeah, okay. So as Emma was saying in the beginning, like who will be profiting from this agenda? So my initial question is precisely this one. So why hydrogen and in whose interest? It was anticipated that the corporations, they have an interest in promoting the hydrogen agenda. And I think it's important to remember that specifically in the period when the European Green Deal was discussed and when the hydrogen strategy was discussed, these corporations, they did a massive push to impose hydrogen and CCS as potential so-called solutions for the climate crisis, and so to reach this carbon neutral economy in Europe by 2050. In the research that we did, which was called the Hydrogen Hype, we could see that they had 163 meetings in less than 1 year, which is quite a lot, more than one meeting every 2 or 3 days. And some of the most influential fossil organizations who were really pushing for hydrogen are the main gas transport system operators in Europe. So Snam, the Italian one, is one of them, but also Fluxys, Enagas, Gasunie, and ENSOG, which is this space created by the European Commission, where actually the gas transport system operators are asked to give their projection of the future demand of gas, which is being used then to justify new gas infrastructure. This is like a crazy, one of the many craziness of European Commission that is fully captured by corporations. And these same corporations are those promoting the hydrogen agenda. So I think it's quite important to keep this in mind. In the case of Italy, Snam was also successfully influencing the Italian recovery plan. The company, together with the other energy companies, they had 102 meetings in less than 1 year with the government, who was designing probably the biggest public funding scheme for the Italian economy in many decades. I would say like since probably the Second World War. And the result was that hydrogen had an important role in the plan. We had more than 3 billion euros dedicated to hydrogen projects. And the most important element is that if you look at how the money was oriented, it was totally oriented to create a demand for hydrogen. CCS and hydrogen, they have been framed as like key technologies for the transition to a carbon neutral economy. This idea had a hype in 2020, and it was actually used to shape a number of policies, not only those that I mentioned, that would have then guaranteed the political and the financial support for the hydrogen agenda in the coming years. This happened in particular, for instance, through the Connecting Europe Facility program, which is the program where precisely the Commission is selecting the energy strategic infrastructure for Europe, both within Europe and connecting Europe with the neighboring countries. So the projects of common interest, but also the projects of mutual interest. And it happened also through the establishment of a specific program called IPCEI, which is the Important Projects of Common European Interest, which is basically allowing member states to derogate on the competition law and to allow very important fiscal, let's say, discounts for the main projects of production and transport of hydrogen. This is all oriented to create a market for hydrogen in Europe. And it's also oriented to define what type of regulation we want to give to this market, which means also what kind of subsidies member states wants to guarantee for the remuneration of the investment, for instance, related to the infrastructure. So what we have on the plate is much more than covering the cost of the investments. It's really about maintaining this system in the years to come, and also being able to maintain a certain price for hydrogen, which is the key element that, for instance, for the industry, is helping them to decide whether they want to choose or not hydrogen for their production. And understand, so the cheaper it is, the more likely industry is to kind of choose it. But in order to have it cheap, there are a number of things that should be done, including we need a massive input of public funding from the European Union, the European Commission, and from member states. So what is being said very often is that this is all about creating a new market for new players. It's all about transitioning away from fossil fuels. But if we actually look in details, then what is happening on the ground, we see that, for instance, in Italy, but also in Spain, the corporation that is like on pole position to become the new hydrogen transport system operator is Snam in the case of Italy, is Enagas in the case of Spain. So there is no new players coming in. It's the old players that are just reconfiguring themselves for a new business. And so there are many different pieces of legislation, like I was saying before, where hydrogen is being pushed through. The European gas package is one of them. It was discussed last year. It was finalized and approved. Now member states, they have to integrate it into their own internal regulation. But for instance, the European, like the package that was approved by the European Commission, by the Council, by the member states, is allowing already an extension for the same type of regulation and subsidies that we have in place for gas, also for hydrogen. This will have massive implications in terms of cost, because in the beginning we talk about two markets that are running in parallel. So we talk about potentially doubling the costs for the for citizens. This is really taxpayers' money that is being used, not only money coming from the energy bills. Another regulation which is being discussed actually right now in the beginning of 2025 is the Clean Industrial Deal. And I just took a quote from Hydrogen Europe, which is one of the main corporate association, like a business association promoting hydrogen in Europe. SNAM is a member of it, and many other gas TSOs. And it's clear that what they are asking to decision makers is to address market failures, like they call them, simplify regulation, catalyze private sector investment. And why do they do it? They do it because it is like the one of the main reasons why we don't see like many projects materializing. Like we have a lot of proposals, a lot of memorandum of understanding, but we see very little really happening in terms of production of hydrogen inside Europe, outside Europe, and infrastructure, is because one of the key elements is how much public funding will be used for de-risking the capital that private investors will put into these projects. So this, again, it's a public subsidy that is oriented to make a private debt becoming public. So this is really, it has implications both for member states in Europe and for governments where hydrogen should be produced, like the European Commission is wishing, like in the African continent, in Latin America, in other places, because the risk is very high that using these de-risking mechanisms means covering, like, for instance, a guarantee on a certain investment, which will then become a public debt in case the investment is just failing. Price support mechanisms, this is what every corporation is asking for, both those that are producing or willing to produce hydrogen and those that are potentially interested to use it. And this is very key because everybody is saying it has to be cheap. And right now it is not cheap at all. It's much more expensive than, like, green hydrogen is more expensive than blue. Blue is not existing because CCS is just not existing anywhere on an industrial scale. It's just a promise for the future that CO2 will be captured and stored permanently. And it is more expensive than gas. So there is very, very little interest in this moment. And this is important to keep in mind among industry in Europe for this new potential commodity. So this is the last point. There is no demand for hydrogen in Europe in this moment. And so there is no justification for actually long distance transport infrastructure. There is just a political will that is like pushing hard for this infrastructure to start to shape and for investors to move in this potential, as I say, business. What are the impacts? So just to give you a quick overview, I'm speaking about SNAM, not only because it's the Italian transport system operator and we have a hardcore campaign against them, but also because SNAM is a very relevant player in Europe. If you look, for instance, into the Balkans, SNAM is controlling DESFA, which is the Greek transport system operator for gas, and is the main promoter of new hydrogen-ready infrastructure across the Balkans, like East Balkans, West Balkans. So this is just to give you an example. And also because NAM is quite good in using, this communication strategy by which it's all about the transition, it's all about being relevant players in the transition. So the gas infrastructure, They are not gas infrastructure anymore. They are called, they talk about multi-molecule infrastructure. They talk about like a sustainable development of infrastructure and this kind of terminology. This is a map showing all the areas of interest of SNAM. So it controls companies outside of Italy, across Europe. It controls key strategic infrastructure in Europe. It controls also strategic infrastructure outside of Europe. One of them, we will discuss it later, and it's the connection between Algeria, Tunisia, and Italy. But for instance, also SNAM is controlling, has a 25% stake into the pipeline that is being used from Israel to export its gas to Egypt and then to Europe. So it has a very critical role in the ongoing genocide, for instance, in Gaza. We look at the investment plan of SNAM and we realize that for as much as the company is talking about, transition, actually the majority of the money is projected to go into new gas infrastructure. They are, of course, described as hydrogen ready, but that is just, I think it's it's a communication exercise in this moment, because even though the company claims that 70% of the network it controls is hydrogen ready, in fact, that means that it's ready to transport a certain percentage of hydrogen that is around 5% in this moment, and that it could go up to 20% in the future. But for instance, there is no legislation at the moment in Italy allowing the transport of hydrogen across our transport system or our distribution system. So there is zero hydrogen being transported in this moment. What we see also is that, for instance, the company has been successful to get already some public funding for its agenda. So the hydrogen backbone that we were mentioning before already got 24 million in grants from the Connecting Europe facility. And the CCS project that SNAM is promoting with Eni in Ravenna already got 400 million in grants. We were not able to identify if we talk about a grant given by the Italian state or by some European mechanism. It's not money that was given through the Connecting Europe facility, but the company is declaring it. So we believe it's they truly got the funding. Governments are talking about energy security. So hydrogen since 2022 became relevant also for energy security in Europe and in Italy. And it's, of course, like used to as the main technology that will lead us into a carbon neutrality. Companies, as I was saying, like SNAM, as I was saying before, is talking about multi-molecule infrastructure, sustainable development of infrastructure. But what we see actually on the ground, we see that a lot of fast tracking and simplification is being pushed through in order to have these projects move forward very quickly, and with a significant restriction of the participation spaces. So there is no consultation, no information at all for the general public about the real implications of the building or simply retrofitting of this infrastructure. This is quite scary, but it's part of a process that also includes increased repression of civil society. We had like some very terrible laws that were passed during the last year that are more and more criminalizing every form of dissent to the decision making, in particular when the opposition is against the projects that are considered of priority for the state, for the European Commission. So maybe a few words about the South H2 corridor. This is the key infrastructure that SNAM is including in its investment plan, but it's also included in REPowerEU as an energy security project contributing to energy security of Europe. It's part of the Italian hydrogen strategy that was passed in November 2024. It's part of the Mattei plan, which is like a big foreign policy exercise of the Meloni government, by which Italy is just reconfiguring its like the corporate penetration into the African continent and reorganizing the public funding for development aid and for external cooperation and for climate action in Africa in order to reorient it to benefit Italian private business, basically. The South H2 corridor is also part of the EU Gateway, which is the biggest infrastructure plan of Europe that was designed to respond to the Chinese Belt and Road and also to like other big powers in infrastructure plans. It's basically a pipeline of 3,300 kilometers that should connect North Africa, in particular Algeria and Tunisia, with Germany. So Italy is just planning to make some money becoming a hydrogen hub. Like before it wanted to be a gas hub, now it's a hydrogen hub, and basically trying to get its share through the transport of this hydrogen. But as I was saying before, there is no real demand in Italy. So it's purely a transport project. We see it as a neo-colonial project as well. It's claiming that it could transport up to 4 million tons of green hydrogen from Algeria and Tunisia to Germany, and that this hydrogen will be produced at low cost in an area that is desertic or semi-desertic, where water access, but also energy access and land access to land are issues of social tension locally. So why it should be at low cost? Of course, because this is like part of the idea is that European corporations can externalize some costs that they would have to pay otherwise if this hydrogen production was taking place in Europe. So they want to just not pay it and move ahead producing it in other countries where, I mean, if we look at both Algeria and Tunisia, there is no political and civil rights guaranteed for people. There is like just no space for organizing an opposition, not to energy projects, not to any other kind of projects. So I think this is the context we should keep in mind. Why SNAM is pushing this? Of course, because it needs to keep high the market value of its own assets. If we are into a framework where by 2050 we should fully decarbonize our economy and phase out fossil fuels, all the assets of SNAM will completely lose value. But in this context, where the same assets with some additional investment, they could be used to transport other types of gas, like hydrogen, but also biogas, then it means that for the company, there is a new business model that the company is building. But what about all of us? What about the collectivity? Like, is this really going into a direction of, reorganizing our economy and trying to reshape the way in which we live in a more just, like socially and climate and environmental just way? We think this is just not the case. Maybe I'm just leaving you these slides because there is some interesting information about the ownership of the pipelines, and this is like the overall European plan. So the South HU corridor is just one of the many corridors for the import of hydrogen that Europe is planning and European corporations are planning. And the plan is really big. They talk about up to 130 billion investments. Maybe these are also relevant information for Austrian activists, because this is the first production project in Tunisia and also the largest one. Total is leading, but there are a number of Austrian corporations that are involved. And it has some very crazy investment numbers, because we talk like what Total is saying is that this investment will be up to 6 billion in the first phase, but up to 40 billion euros for the final phase in 2050. And the idea behind this project is that, it will be just kind of easy to acquire the land, the needed land to produce all the hydrogen. They project to produce up to 1 million tons of hydrogen by 2050, which will be 1/4 of the hydrogen that could be transported through the South HU corridor. Yeah, maybe these are the questions that we should address collectively, but I don't want to take more time, and we could maybe look into them in the question and answer phase. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Elena. Just for the people who just joined the seminar and for everyone else to remind, we have different tools to ask questions. We have in the chat the link for Slido, where you can put questions that we will vote and read out. And now you also have the option to ask questions directly to Elena or put some questions in the chat.
Maybe while people are thinking what to ask, because I feel like Elena shared a lot of expertise with us. Maybe Elena, you want to share what your next steps in your work will be in addressing the hydrogen hype and the questions of corporate interest.
Yes, so one thing that we have just published is a statement. We are circulating an international statement which was built together with some groups from North Africa, from Southern Africa, and across the continent, which is basically a declaration of principles, I would call it, explaining our opposition to long-distance transport of green hydrogen and to public support of any kind of infrastructure that are oriented to that. So if you are part of a collective or you can help to share it, maybe that could be also very useful to start a discussion in your collective or in your constituency on whether it could make sense to sign on and then to join the groups that are trying to oppose any form of public support to this infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. I've read the statement or the list of principles, and I think it's a really great step in the right direction. We'll wait 1 more minute for questions. Don't be shy.
I have a question. Thank you, Elena, for your input. I'm also an activist from Attac, and I have a question how you raise interest to the topic of energy, green hydrogen, to other people in Italy, because I feel it's kind of difficult to raise attention to such an important topic, but it's like with all the ongoing crisis, kind of difficult because it's not like a catchy topic.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we try to to discuss it with collectives that are already interested in energy issues. And we try to discuss it also with researchers and people who are trying to study it. There are some research groups that are looking into the social impacts of hydrogen. And we also relate it pretty much to the CCS project. So we are campaigning also against this CCS plan, which is both like an offshore storage of CO2 and a network of, for the moment, 100 kilometers of pipelines to transport CO2. This is linked to a project of blue hydrogen in Italy. So, and it's actually starting to materialize. So people are starting to see things happening on the ground. And that makes it a bit, at least an entry point to discuss it. But yes, I agree that in general, the discussion about energy is not so catchy. I think it's up to us to being able to frame it in a larger context, because it's really about how we are reshaping our society, like in which direction do we want to go in terms of reorganizing our society, not only like with the perspective of decarbonizing it, but more with the perspective of creating a society that is more just, that has different values than the market values at the center. So I think this is the approach that we are using.
Hey, then thank you. There was another question on Slido. What solution do you prefer for an affordable energy transition in the field of hydrogen?
Yeah, so we don't see hydrogen part of a path, towards a more democratic and just society. We imagine that there are a number of things that should be addressed before thinking, how much energy we need and using the projections that are using today. I think we should be able to reassess our energy needs and reassess what we want to do in the future, how much energy will we need, and then how do we want to produce it. So in general, the framework of local community-owned renewable energy is much more in that direction in our perspective. And it's very difficult to create this space and to have this conversation in Italy. But as I was saying, maybe using an approach really bottom up, so really starting to discuss it in the territories is probably the best way forward. In general, I mean, we don't see, like, this government is not, and not even the governments we had before in the last decades, I would say, they have been never thinking in terms of what people actually need. They have been always oriented to look into what corporations want. And this is the approach, like when they have been discussing the hydrogen strategy, They simply called in Snam, Eni, and the other big energy corporations controlled by the state and asked them, what do you want, basically? And so I think that this is just not this is not helpful for us. It's not helpful to to create the society that we want. So we really need to start from different questions eventually, I think. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. I think at Attac Austria, we definitely share that vision that we have to start with needs of society and the energy transition of those needs first before we start thinking about anything else. And maybe even think about changing the structures and the question of ownership of energy and public energy. But I think this is the perfect point to give the stage to Jakob and his view on hydrogen and transition potential.
Yeah, awesome. That's actually really perfect transition, I think. Let me just figure that here out. And you all should see the presentation, but not my notes, I hope. Perfect. So so I will present the current hydrogen developments and transformative possibilities in Austria and beyond. And yeah, just to briefly give you an overview of the content of my presentation, I will first cover hydrogen developments in Austria with a strong focus on international dimension and implications for social ecological justice. And then in the second part, I will focus on transformative possibilities that go beyond the transition from one energy source to another, but also challenge global socioeconomic structures and power relations towards more justice-based approaches. So starting off with the Austrian strategy. On the demand side, it prioritizes the use of hydrogen for decarbonizing key industrial sectors like steel production, chemical industry, cement production, and to a lesser extent also for mobility and other sectors. On the supply side, it plans to produce hydrogen in 2030, at least have 1 gigawatt of production capacities installed, which would cover about 80% of the current demand, which is 5 terawatt hours annually. But at 2040, the hydrogen strategy assumes that we have a demand of 67 to 75 terawatt hours per annum. This would be a massive increase, a 14 times increase from the current consumption in 15 years. So this is, of course, to a certain extent due to the new hydrogen applications, for example, in steel production, in the chemical industry. But also researchers from Greenpeace have pointed out that there are obviously no significant measures for demand reduction or efficiency increases in energy use in general. The renewable energy that would be needed for such amounts would cover about half of the total land area of the Austrian state of Burgenland, just to give you an idea of what this means. And this is actually where the imports come in, as Elena already said, externalizing the costs to, mostly global south. But staying in Austria for a while now, for the transport, Austrian plan is that there's a pipeline grid planned, also really connected to Snam, actually, to the Italian grid. Here you can see in the picture the Austrian grid with the dark blue lines being the 1,200 kilometers of repurposed gas pipelines, and the light blue lines would be the new lines that would be built for hydrogen transport. And then, for the development and the implementation of the strategy, the Climate Ministry has set up the Hydrogen Partnership Austria. And this hydrogen partnership has an advisory board, which is dominated almost exclusively by CEOs of key private actors, businesses that I will cover in the next slide. And there is clearly a lack of high-level involvement or any involvement at all of civil society organizations or labor unions. Or critical academics. So there are only few scientists that are involved, and they more or less just cover technological or economic perspectives. There are, for example, no social scientists involved. Moving on to the key actors and the conflicting interests that shape the Austrian emerging hydrogen economy. We have this as pushers, I would say, private actors. First and foremost, we have demanding industries like steel production, like the first, for example, or chemical refineries like OMV, also transport like aviation, Austrian Airlines. And on the other side of the value chain, we have also producers of technologies for hydrogen production, like Andritz, that wants to export electrolyzers. And then we also have energy companies and gas grid operators like Verbund, Gas Connect Austria. And then, apart from these private sector interests, we also have labor organizations like the Labor Union Federation and civil society actors like Attac. And then we have like a couple of main conflicting interests. It's really hard to boil down, and I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but there is this debate also in Austria of green versus blue hydrogen. But besides that, there is, I think, a broader conflict that is between a market-based and really green growth-oriented approach, just transition approach, and then a more radical approaches that would actually lead to a fundamental social ecological transformation. The green growth approach is by far currently the dominant approach, and it is represented in the current strategy, and it is the approach that is favored by private actors. It includes broad hydrogen application in the future. It includes private financing, but with a lot of public de-risking, as we have already heard, like a lot of public subsidies. And all in all, a strong role for private actors in the development of this hydrogen economy, which leads to limited public oversight, obviously. Then, like another approach, I would say, is a just transition approach, which is kind of championed by labor unions with some support by other organizations. And this is not a concrete set of demands, but I would say they favor a targeted hydrogen use, more state-level planning, for example, through binding regulation for giving out subsidies. And they also pay more attention to the implications for workers, for example. And then we have more radical and transformative approaches, usually championed by civil society organizations. And I would really name the initiative for the democratization of energy provision systems. That is an initiative that actually is made and put forward by Attac. There are also other initiatives that call for global justice, for example. And the general idea is to move away from profit interests to a focus on public needs and common good. Moving on to the international dimension, because as we have heard, like if the current strategy is followed, Austria will depend on 70% of its hydrogen demand on imports. And this would largely come from the global south, especially Northern Africa, and in particular from Tunisia, as we have already heard from Elena. But there are several social ecological risks. For a more detailed analysis, I would recommend you to look into a study by Müller et al. I've also put it in the sources part. But the study has looked into like the main social ecological risk areas. There are 4 key areas that relate to the use and access to land, water, and energy, as well as background injustices, such, for example, a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. And the government, the Austrian government, has commissioned an import study looking into anything else, basically, but none of those risks. So they have focused on questions of costs and logistics, but really disregard or not adequately assess the risks for local communities, for example. This import study also looks into the case of Chile, which is actually the case that I've studied in more detail and where I've researched last September. And the Chilean hydrogen strategy also tries to or aims to exploit like a strong renewable energy production potential. Like here in the picture, you can see on the strong winds in Magallanes bending the trees. They're constant winds. They are actually sometimes growing that direction. Yeah, so the Chilean strategy it focuses on also a green growth, is also a green growth-based strategy. It includes large-scale export-oriented projects. And for those, it aims to attract private investors, usually foreign investors, also an Austrian investors investing there. And it aims to attract those with public de-risking schemes. And it has actually taken up $1 billion loan from international donors, which, yeah, if this industry does not develop, would need to pay back with probably with interest. So there is kind of also a debt trap in addition to all of this. Yeah, and furthermore, the Chilean policy process for the hydrogen policy is really influenced by international actors, most notably the German Agency for International Cooperation. And the actual project developments are also dominated by foreign actors, foreign investors, and energy multinationals. And usually the argument is, yeah, we will create economic benefits, but those are really quite limited. There will not be a lot of jobs created. There is limited potential for linkages and economic upgrading, and rather the risk for developing enclave economies and deepening dependencies and unequal exchange. So despite the really limited benefits, local communities will have to bear the social ecological costs, such as a massive territorial occupation, threats to biodiversity, social well-being, and a further marginalization of indigenous communities in the area. Just to give you an idea about the territorial occupation, here on the left, you can see a map of all the announced hydrogen projects in Magallanes in the southern region, with the red and orange parts showing the most advanced projects. And the picture on the right shows a map of the same region in the same scale, but with the country of Slovenia on top. So this is just to give you an idea of how massive this scale is. This is, yeah, incredibly massive. So concluding this part, there are some key issues with hydrogen development that we have heard now a couple of times. The current developments along the green growth paradigm is strongly influenced by the interests of private capital, and yet the actual development doesn't really happen. It happens really slowly because there is not a lot of rentability in this sector, and there are a lot of uncertainties in market development. But governments are kind of trying to work around that by through public subsidies or infrastructure investments in gas grids. Basically, what they are doing is using public money to offer benefits to private actors. Also, yeah, currently the dominant strategies usually do not provide for demand reduction, such as in the Austrian case, despite several possibilities, which I will cover in the next part. Furthermore, like for hydrogen imports, the social ecological risks have not been adequately assessed. So along these lines, we see several injustices, such as the distribution of costs and benefits at the cost of local communities to the benefit of corporate actors in the global north, or the lack of civil society involvement, or the externalization of social and ecological implications. So let's leave that part and look towards more transformative possibilities and alternatives in Austria and beyond. Starting with like a systems-wide perspective, I think it's really important to start with degrowth. Degrowth and demand reduction is mandatory in the global north. And we have actually a lot of possibilities. For example, steel and iron production, where we have just in this sector alone is expected to make up 40 to 50% of hydrogen demand in Austria. Austrian steel is strongly entangled with the supply industry of the automotive sector, most notably in Germany, which, as we know, is not only also a threat or contributing to climate change, but also struggling like a lot right now. Switching our mobility systems to public transport would, on the one hand, it would allow us to maintain the existing jobs and production capacities for the moment, like for the while that we need to ramp up public transport. And then we can degrow these industries in a socially equitable way and thereby contribute to an overall reduction in resource use and hydrogen demand, especially in the long term. Another field is construction. We can move towards alternative methods without or with less steel, or that would also reduce the demand for cement, for example. This is the HO project that you can see here. It's a project in Vienna, which uses predominantly wood and thereby strongly reduces steel and cement consumption. Then we also have the chemical industry. Here we have two striking examples, which actually together make up more than 3/4 of the current hydrogen demand in the European Union. First are the oil refineries. They currently make up 57%. So we actually need the hydrogen, or like on what current hydrogen demand estimates are based on the current demand, is for oil refineries for creating gasoline. We want to phase that out anyways, and the sooner the better. And using hydrogen for refineries. Then the other option would be green hydrogen-based ammonia, which is used for fertilizer, or should be used for fertilizer production. Here we can reduce demand by switching to more towards organic farming, for example. And then finally, we also have transport, where we don't need to have substitute current demand with hydrogen, but we can reduce overall demand for shipping, for aviation. Just in shipping, by cutting all oil and gas shipments, we could reduce global shipping by up to 50%. So those are like a lot of options, and like the current demand is just completely overstated, and we first should look into, as Elena has said, options for demand reduction. But another interesting and transformative approach is the adoption of hydrogen in small scale and decentralized energy systems. Here, it's important to acknowledge the importance of technological path dependencies. So therefore, we should start early with the technological optimization of small-scale systems for hydrogen production, storage, and reconversion. So for example, we could optimize small-scale electrolyzer units for a maximum output during really small windows of time, where there is an oversupply of renewable energy. Let's say we have a really, really sunny day, we have a lot of solar radiation, there's an oversupply, which means the energy created is not used. This could be used to power a hydrogen generator. The hydrogen could be stored in tanks, and then when we have longer periods of undersupply because of winter or rainy seasons, the hydrogen could be reconverted into electricity. So we've coupled that with batteries for short-term balancing. You could use hydrogen to stabilize decentralized grids, which would be a huge boost to energy communities and in turn also increase energy sovereignty and contribute to the democratization of energy provision and use. So communities can actually decide for themselves how to use and be more efficient with their energy. Further use cases could be, backups for off-grid or remote communities instead of diesel generators when there is a power outage. Or it could be used as a fuel for farming machinery, which is quite fuel intensive as well. And in addition to democratization, which is, I think, a goal in itself, such an approach would also reduce the local impacts and contribute to increased energy efficiency. And this is an example of such a project. It is a project in Ghana, which aims to offer an alternative to this fossil-based backups like diesel generators. And it tries also to do some technological optimization. And what's interesting, it also aims to not exploit this, but cooperate with local companies and possibly in the future manufacture such systems in Ghana, which kind of leads us to the next slide, using hydrogen for green and just industrialization in Global South. So what does this mean? This quite broad point, but while degrowth is mandatory for specific sectors in the global north, industrial development in the global south is also necessary to provide for good living standards in these countries. So at the same time, we need to take into account the growing emissions, the growing resource use. So these industries will need to be planned efficiently and used strategically only like for the common needs and basic needs, and not for creating profit or growth in any ways. But this could provide energy access, mobility, health, food, housing, etc. So hydrogen would not be important for all of those use cases. Actually, the applications are quite limited, but it can contribute to such transformations. But yeah, obviously this means that hydrogen production in the global south should prioritize internal and regional demand over international trade, which in turn would also reduce energy losses from transporting hydrogen. It reduce the overall intensity of global logistics because less goods are produced, needs to be shipped through international value chains. But yeah, the obvious question here is how do we get to such a point? And I think there is a really nice answer or a really nice initiative that I'd like to present is the public pathway approach, which is championed by TUED, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, an alliance of more than 120 labor unions, mainly from the Global South, plus some global union federations and civil society organizations. And they have acknowledged the fundamental role of ownership and property and the unequal distribution of ownership and property in the capitalist economic system, which creates like the problems that we have, and have formulated a public pathway approach to actually actively challenge this current system with key transformative demands such as public planning of energy transitions based on the move towards public ownership of energy infrastructure, etc., which would mean nationalization or socialization where necessary, and should be financed by climate justice funds and global debt cancellations. They have also published a working paper on hydrogen going into the same direction, and they emphasize that, quote, if hydrogen is freed from the imperatives of creating profits for private owners and investors, the decisions about the technological options, about the scale and timing, and when we need and where we need hydrogen, can instead prioritize efficient resource use, ecological impacts, implications for jobs, local communities, etc. So this leads me to the end of my presentation. There are several key conclusions. I think that hydrogen is necessary to decarbonize some specific sectors, which we will need in any kind of energy transition or transformation. We will need steel for building railways if we want to switch to public transport. But the current strategies envisage hydrogen as an option for green growth. They ignore the necessary demand reductions and they externalize social ecological consequences to producer countries and local communities, especially in the global south. And also to create the emerging hydrogen trade relations, foster unequal exchange, and follow patterns of neocolonial appropriation. However, there are also several transformative possibilities, and we should start with reducing hydrogen demand in the global north. We can use hydrogen for decentralized energy systems, contribute to the democratizing of energy systems as well. And for all of that, we need to move away from a capitalist and market-based approach and towards public ownership and planning, such as suggested in the public pathway approach, but to it, or in several other initiatives. And I think this leaves us with one final question. How do we actually get there? But that's an open question for you.
Well, thank you very much, Jakob, for your presentation. And our suggestion would be that we start with the common questions in Slido to Jakob and Elena, because Elena has to leave earlier. And then afterwards, we have still time for more specific questions, maybe to Jakob. thank you very much for all your questions on Slido. I'm going to try to collect some of them. So the first question to Jakob and Elena would be, do you see the possibility that social movements that are clearly against hydrogen will cooperate with unions in a common struggle against hydrogen? Maybe Elena could also give us some insights on the Italian context on that. And then connected to this question, there was also the question of how framings in social society in the so-called global south about green hydrogen, how they are framed, for example, in Tunisia. So maybe that's the first question to you both.
I think it depends a lot on what how can I say, what political horizon will have the trade unions and the movements, in the sense that right now what we see is that trade unions are just either not having a public position on hydrogen, or they defend jobs. They defend jobs of every industry, like of the fossil fuel industry, of the most polluting one, and they don't have a clear ecological perspective. So that is, of course, a problem, because, I mean, if we want a more just society, we also need to get rid of all the impacts that certain type of industry is having, and of this phenomenon that we know very well in Italy, but it's very well known in many countries in the global south, by which politics decide that some areas have to be sacrificed for the so-called bigger good of the collectivity. And so you have areas where people are literally dying because of the impacts of a certain industrial model, which has to change. So I think if the trade unions are open to have that conversation, probably there could be spaces of, where an agreement could be found. But maybe another element is also that we have to get out of the logic that is market driven. So until like was saying Jakob, we have this green growth perspective, which is in most cases is not even green, is just portrayed as green. It is very difficult to have a conversation. If we say that we need hydrogen only for certain sectors, that means that we don't need a market for hydrogen. So we don't need to build the type of infrastructure that is being planned today. We don't need the South H2 corridor, for instance. But the fact that the infrastructure that are being promoted are infrastructure that are needed for building a market makes us think that maybe we are not talking about only certain sectors. We are not talking about using hydrogen for niche production. We are talking about something else. And so I think it's quite important that we are able to define the frame of the conversation, and then we can see whether there can be opportunities to join the struggles between movements, trade unions, and other players.
Yeah, maybe adding on that, I think I mean, I personally know the challenges connected to like bringing in such perspectives and struggles in labor unions. But I think that, like, especially in the global north, it is much more difficult than in the global south. I think like TUET approach with the public pathway is an interesting initiative. And yeah, I would actually urge civil society organizations in the global north to cooperate with trade unions in the global south, which could, also build up pressure for global labor unions, for labor unions in the global north themselves. Because, in the end, I think it is necessary also to kind of, not seeing each other as enemies, but really trying to focus on, a common goal, which definitely needs to be defined in a way that is not green growth or market-based, which is difficult to convince labor unions, especially right now. But I think this, will be or could be possible. I think it's also really important that we strengthen transnational alliances in that regard. I think this is something that I would really highlight and that I've found especially also interesting in Global South, where labor unions also have really like different problems and challenges, but can actually, I think this could actually foster like a lot of opportunities for transnational cooperation in the future, which will be necessary, definitely.
Yeah, thank you both for this extensive answer. I think this already relates to another question we have in the Slido, which also unfortunately will be probably the last question with Elena, but what do you think? How can ownership structures in the hydrogen economy be transformed? So I guess the hydrogen economy not just being in the global north, but also extending to the so-called global south?
It's quite difficult. Like we see that as from the presentation of Jakob, it was very clear. Like we have governments in Europe that are supporting specific corporations that are from Germany, from Italy, from other countries to just get their own market share in even in developing projects in the global south. So until we are in this agenda, which is a very it's a commercial agenda at the end of the day, and it's about hydrogen, but it's also about reconfiguring the role of European industry in the global market. Until we are in this framework, it's very difficult to imagine that we will get out of a neo-colonial model by which, these corporations and these governments are seeing the rest of the world just as a place to conquer. And there is no space for a real discussion about, doing investments that are good for everyone. It's only about getting the resources that we need, getting cheaper land, cheaper energy, cheaper water, and make more profit, not even in the interest of the people in Europe. It's just in the interest of capital and of global business. So it's a very aggressive agenda, I would say, and I think it's very important to keep it in mind. So for communities and for people working grassroots in the global south, is very challenging to find other ways to approach this topic. I mean, what they can see is just an aggression coming from outside or coming from the bigger players in their own economy who think they can, have a key partnership role with European corporations. So it's very, very difficult to imagine that this dynamic could be adjusted in a way that could be beneficial for, especially for communities in the global south, not for governments. The effort, I think, from our side should be to find ways to build, yes, international connections, but also to choose really on which side do we want to stand, and how can we build a common agenda with communities in the global south. This is very, very challenging, but we have to admit that the system is completely corrupt, and we can't expect it's going to do any good if it remains like framed according to the rules of today. So for me, it's very hard to imagine that this hydrogen agenda could be shifted in a way that becomes beneficial for the most marginalized communities. And for me, this is the real question when you talk about social and economic justice.
Jakob, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, but I was also waiting for, I don't know when Elena needs to leave, so I was giving her some space to say goodbye. I don't know.
Right now, so thank you everyone, and I may catch up with the organizers to understand how the conversation continued.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And yeah, reacting to that, I think this is also really much like the case. I think like as long as we don't really change like more fundamental changes, it's really difficult to see how hydrogen and all can actually contribute, like in a kind of to a social ecologic just transformation. But on the other hand, I think, like, for example, the use of hydrogen and decarbonized and decentralized energy systems is something where, we have specific energy communities that say it is a bottom-up approach, which does not necessarily include, it does not necessarily, in the current system it does, but it does not necessarily has to include, corporate structures, etc. And it also doesn't produce additional profit. It's not to produce additional profit. It is to, stabilize electricity and energy consumption for local communities. So I think would be a really different approach to, for example, what has been offered, or like an initiative from Colombia, where Gustavo Petro has this idea of, creating energy communities, which would be made up of, local communities and indigenous communities, for example, in the northern state of La Guajira. And they should act like work together, basically, or be the partners of these large multinational corporations, so that they can have a share of the profits from hydrogen production. What this means, like it sounds good, I guess, at the first moment, but on the other hand, it means that those people will be incorporated, sometimes even against their will, because what is the opportunity is not to say no. The opportunity is to say, okay, we do that in that way, or we do it in this way. Like, you can either get a share of the profit or not, or you're out, but you will be displaced or anything anyway. So basically, it's not like a lot of choice, and then they will be incorporated in like the growth-based capitalist system. So they will need to, continue cooperating. They can't reverse this decision at one point. So I think this is really like a really complex question, but I think like on the first thing is to ask ourselves, like what we in the global north can do, besides maybe connecting more like internationally, and shining like try to pay and cast attention to that to those issues. I think it's also important to actually go into the systems and structures we have right here, like, for example, labor unions, to make them move, to make them take on more radical approaches, because they as well will be eliminated if they don't do it. Looking at the fascist uprisings in Europe right now, but also moving to, socializing, for example, large energy producers. I mean, Verbund is already in the hands of the state. It should be in the hands of the public, and the public should decide. And I'm pretty sure that the public wouldn't decide to, make people suffer so we can produce more cars. And I think those are like questions, I think justice, if people are empowered to actually decide and be participate in political decisions, I think we would actually create more just futures. And I think Vergesellschaftung, socialization, is a big step ahead in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, Jakob. Looking at the time, I'm just going to share some organizational notes. So thank you so much for already providing answers. I feel like we've got some bits and bobs also kind of answering other questions in the Slido. We will be able to share the presentations and also we will share the recording where you can also re-listen to, I think, a very interesting and great arguments we've heard today. So I think pointing to our position as Attac Austria now to wrap up, I think it already became apparent in the last 1.5 hours that we are also on the side of thinking of more participation, more democratization, and also no neo-colonial projects in the way we produce and also consume energy. And we also think that the way prices are built and profits are generated has to be rethought. So if you're interested in that, then check out our website where we have further informations and Q&As and Mythbusters. Also on hydrogen, I think we also join the lines of argumentation from Jakob and Elena that demand for hydrogen in Austria really has to be rethought. And if we want to have a social and ecological just hydrogen use in Austria, we really have to think of exclusively regional production of green hydrogen and no other sorts of hydrogen. And also we have to stop imports from the global south and also stop supporting exploitative and extractivist projects in the global south. And also stop the H2 pipeline that Elena has mentioned. And I think also, yeah, be aware that hydrogen cannot be used everywhere in the same way that we're being told by gas lobbyists. Jakob, you want to add something?
Yeah, just a little thing. Yeah, well, we talk a lot about like stop this and stop that. But we also really need to address that like the global south needs investment, needs like financial and economic space to actually also move towards some directions because they are actually doing a lot of this, I think, to attract investments in the renewable energy sector, which we will need in the future.
Yeah, I think that is also a perfect bridge to what I was about to say next, because in the way of rethinking energy and energy cooperation globally, we will have a great webinar in 2 weeks on international energy communities and the way they are empowering change with Rowan from the Transnational Institute that we're looking forward very much. The invitation will go out to all of you again. And I think this will really spark also the connection between discussions on socialization in the global north, but also the way energy needs to be transformed in relation and in each local condition that we've now seen. So I would say thank you very much to Jakob, also to Elena, who already had to leave, and thank you to all of you who stayed till the end. We're really looking forward to continue this discussion. And yeah, hope to see many of you soon in 2 weeks. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.